Hey, it's Russell Morris reading in Exile. Last time we were talking about books about the end times and so forth, and I couldn't reach my fiction and poetry sections on this, and so let's talk about those now. Again, these are not the sorts of things, if I'm sitting down and coming up with a list, here's what you have to read on this. This is just literally walking past the shelf, looking at things and being reminded of, here's something I think you ought to look at. So if you're thinking about sort of last things, end times, sorts of things, when it comes to fiction, Last Battle, of course, Chronicles of Narnia, the sort of ending of that. What I really like about The Last Battle is at the conclusion of it, that says this. Aslan, of course, is talking to the four children. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. For their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. That is massively important because it's demonstrating what Jesus has taught us, which is that this moment is just an internship, or as Lewis puts it, the title page for what our real life actually is. That's massively important. Tolkien, Fellowship of the Ring, the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, I would argue is a last things because it's showing you sort of what the climax of all of these stories are, not just the big sort of mythic story of Middle-earth, but also the particular story of Frodo and Sam and how those all run into that. We'll talk about that later, but that's one that I would suggest to you. This is Annie Dillard, The Maitreys. It's been so long since I've read this. I've read it twice. It's been so long since I read it that I couldn't really remember right now how to give you a good synopsis of it, other than to say it's about a life of a couple, of a family. And the reason I included it in here is because the death scene in this is just so beautifully written and is one of the most evocative things that I've ever read on that subject. And speaking of which, Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy might be the most moving account of an individual human being's death that has been written outside of Scripture. And so you really ought to read this and just see, I mean, everything from just the things that the person is noticing as he is dying. And I would say the same thing about Anton Chekhov has a short story called The Bishop. And it's about a bishop who's also dying, but he has these regrets that come up in his life about whether he should have tried to be a bishop or whether he should have tried to live a more ordinary life, a smaller sort of life. And I've read that short story I don't know how many times, and it always brings up all sorts of good questions that I need to ask and answer. Walker Percy has a book about, the subtitle is A Bad Catholic at a Time Near the End of the World, called Love in the Ruins, and distant ancestor of Thomas More, who's in Louisiana as everything starts to sort of collapse and fall apart. Well worth reading. But also, and this isn't really fiction, but Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. There is some fiction in it. But this book is sort of talking about what's the goal of human existence. And it has a really important section in there about the difference between a suicide and an ex-suicide. Now, Percy, you remember his father died by suicide, and he was really changed by that in all sorts of ways that you can imagine. His grandfather also died by suicide. It's just a long line of suicide in his family. And he talks about being an ex-suicide, of somebody who says, I'm not going to die by suicide. I'm just going to act as though I did. And so everything from this point on is just kind of extra. And that person is able to actually gain his life at that point, because he doesn't, he counts himself as already dead, so he's able to live. We've heard about that from somebody else in a different, consider yourself crucified with Christ, and therefore you live. Here's just a fun thing. This isn't the first of this trilogy, but I can't find it here in my library. And I actually listened to it on audiobook, but it's called The Last Policeman. It's just a fun trilogy about a man who's a detective who's solving a murder mystery with a meteor headed for Earth, an extinction level meteor that's going to destroy the Earth within months. And so it calls itself an existential detective story, but it's about, what matters when you're about to die. And it's also just a fun murder mystery. When it comes to poetry, a lot of poetry on sort of end of things. 4 quartets, I'll talk about this later on. One of the things that I'm really missing right now while we're in quarantine is a group of us gather together and read through 4 quartets. It's really striking. And we're, 2 of us are musicians. One of us is a therapist and a sort of psychological expert, and then there's me. And we read through this, and I'll talk about this when we talk about it later. But the theme of in my beginning is my end, and in my end is my beginning, and sort of how life makes sense in light of that, really, really important. John Updike, not the best poet in the world, although a brilliant novelist in his own right, but I really like this book, Endpoint, which are the last poems that he wrote before his death. And they're about sort of reflections on death. And what I like about it is he talks about, he talks about, for instance, how he says at one point, maybe we meet our heaven at the beginning of life and not at the end, as he's sort of reflecting back on his childhood in Pennsylvania. Of course, I don't agree with that. I think we do have our heaven at the end. But I think his point is valid in that there are signs of grace in our lives that sometimes I don't think we pay attention to until it's sort of the end. And so that's a good piece of poetry there. And then I really like Czesław Miłosz, and he has some poems about death, poems about meaning, but he has one that's really fascinating called A Song on the End of the World, where essentially the point is that just the end of the world is not some big cataclysmic event. It's the normality of bees buzzing around trees. Again, I don't agree with him on that as a Christian. He doesn't agree with himself on that as a Christian. But he's getting to, I think, something along the lines of what Martin Luther was talking about in that famous, almost to a cliche statement now, where when asked what would he do if he knew the world were ending tomorrow, and he said he'd plant a tree. So the cycles of normality and the cataclysmic end of it all are not in conflict with one another. They're actually together in God's ordering of the universe. So that's just some fiction and poetry having to do with end times. What would you like us to talk about? Whether an individual book. If I have it and have read it, we could talk about it, or series of books together like this. Let me know in the comments. See you next time.